They say ancient Rome was the cradle of civilization, but for women accused of certain crimes, it was the cradle of nightmares. Crucifixion, wild beasts, burning alive, punishments so cruel they were designed not just to kill, but to erase you from memory. Today we're opening the vault on the most brutal, most secret, and most unthinkable punishments ever faced by women in Rome. And once you hear them, you'll never think of history the same way again. Chapter 1: Crucifixion, the Cross as a Woman's Tomb. There was no mercy in the Roman cross, no gentleness in its towering shadow, and when it claimed a woman, the cruelty was deliberate, intimate, and designed to leave scars on the memory of all who watched. The punishment of crucifixion was not simply a method of execution, but an act of public theater, a warning carved into flesh, and for a woman, especially a slave, rebel, or foreign prisoner, it was the final erasure of her humanity, because the cross did not kill quickly. It unmade the body slowly, 1 hour at a time, and the audience was invited to savor it. The process began with humiliation, and for women this humiliation was sharpened to its most obscene edge. They were stripped naked, bound or chained, sometimes flogged until their skin was shredded into ribbons, and then dragged through the streets in chains, the jeers of the mob ringing louder than the sound of their own feet stumbling on the stones. The Romans knew that stripping a woman of her clothing was also stripping her of her honor, and in a culture obsessed with dignity and modesty, this was as much a wound as the nails that would later pierce her. At the execution site, she would see the cross, sometimes just a rough wooden stake, other times the infamous T-shape, and know that the upright beam had been used again and again, soaked with the blood, sweat, and waste of those who died before her. Its stench carried on the wind. Before being lifted to the wood, the condemned woman was often scourged with whips tipped with bone or metal, each lash tearing deeper into already exposed muscle. And for a slave, this stage was an unending cycle of agony because the executioners were free to take their time, prolonging the suffering for the crowd's entertainment. Sometimes soldiers and executioners used this moment to commit acts of sexual violence, a final desecration before the body was nailed in place. Then came the piercing of the flesh. Iron nails or heavy spikes driven through the wrists or forearms, sometimes also through the ankles, each blow ringing like a hammer striking a coffin lid. The pain was not only sharp but radiating, burning through every nerve as the weight of the body pulled against the wounds, and there was no position in which relief could be found. The cross was then raised, the woman suspended in the air, the weight of her body tearing at the nailed joints, her chest heaving in shallow, desperate gasps as her lungs slowly collapsed under the strain. Death could take hours, sometimes days, and the Romans preferred it that way. The sun scorched the skin during the day, and at night the cold wind burned like knives, and all the while the audience, citizens, slaves, children, ate, laughed, and pointed, their appetite for blood mixing with their curiosity about how much a human body could endure before breaking. Birds would come, black silhouettes against the sky, perching on the beam, pecking at eyes and lips while the victim still lived, and flies gathered in the torn wounds, their buzzing joining the sound of ragged breathing and distant shouting. The psychological torture was just as sharp as the physical. Every moment stretched into an eternity as the condemned woman was forced to listen to insults shouted from below. Words about her crimes, her body, her worthlessness, and each insult a reminder that she was dying not just in agony, but in disgrace. If she was pregnant, the cruelty deepened. The Romans were not above crucifying women heavy with child, watching two lives fade together, the unborn dying in the womb, while the mother felt her own strength slip away. Sometimes crucifixion was done in groups. Rows of crosses lined like grim monuments on the roadside, the bodies swaying slightly in the breeze, and the condemned could see others around her die, their heads falling forward, their bodies slumping, knowing she would follow soon enough. The end rarely came as mercy. Most died of asphyxiation, the weight of the body pulling down on the lungs until they could no longer draw breath. But some were stabbed or clubbed to hasten the process if the crowd was ready to leave. Others were simply left on the cross to rot, the skeleton hanging for days or weeks as a permanent reminder of Roman power. In the rare case where a woman's family or owner could afford it, her body might be taken down for burial, but often she was left where she hung, the flesh falling away, the bones whitening under the sun, until nothing remained but a memory of screams and the echo of the crowd's laughter. Crucifixion for a woman was more than a punishment. It was a slow erasure of her personhood, a deliberate performance of dominance, where the state, the soldiers, and the mob all shared in her destruction. And in those final hours on the cross, she became not just a criminal in the eyes of Rome, but an object to be consumed by the cruelty of an empire that knew no limit to its hunger for control. Chapter 2. Damnatio ad bestias, the arena's living prey. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, and for a woman it was the kind of death that did not merely kill, but dismantled every shred of dignity before the end. A spectacle engineered to thrill the crowd and stain the sand with a slow, messy slaughter. This was not an execution in the quiet shadows. It was staged under the blazing sun, in the deafening roar of thousands, in an arena where every eye was fixed on the doomed. From the moment the sentence was announced, the condemned woman's fate was no longer her own. Her body became the property of the crowd, her suffering a form of entertainment, her screams a kind of music to Roman ears. Often she was paraded through the city first, stripped to humiliate her, shackled in iron, and driven to the amphitheater while jeering mobs followed. If she was a slave or foreigner, her death was considered cheaper than a day's bread. If she was a disgraced citizen, the cruelty was in showing that even the Roman name could not shield her from the jaws of beasts. Inside the holding pens beneath the arena, the air stank of blood, sweat, and animal musk. Lions pacing in cages, leopards crouched in the dark, bears snorting and pawing at the ground, all starved for days to make their hunger sharper. The condemned woman could hear them before she saw them, the deep rumble of growls echoing off the stone, the scrape of claws against wood, a sound that told her exactly how she would die. Before the gates opened, she might be chained to a stake in the middle of the arena, or left to stand alone. Unarmed, sometimes naked, sometimes dressed in rags meant to mock her, costumes that turned her into a parody of herself. A cruel Roman joke. When the beasts were released, the crowd erupted in a frenzy, cheering as the animals charged across the sand, their muscles rippling, their jaws snapping. The first strike was rarely fatal. Lions would rake their claws across her flesh, tearing skin and muscle, knocking her to the ground before sinking teeth into her limbs. Bears mauled slowly, biting and tearing as they pinned their prey. Leopards attacked in swift bursts, retreating to circle again, each pass leaving fresh wounds. Sometimes the animals were trained to prolong the kill, pawing and clawing at the victim before tearing open the abdomen, spilling her insides onto the dirt for all to see. The pain was unimaginable, but so was the humiliation. The crowd laughed, shouted insults, placed bets on how long she would last, some even calling for the beast to be pulled back just so the torment could begin again. In certain cases, the brutality was staged as a kind of grotesque theater. Women condemned for adultery might be forced to reenact myths in which the female figure was devoured or violated by an animal, the Romans delighting in turning legend into living bloodshed. Sometimes multiple women were sent out at once, each chained in a different part of the arena, their cries mingling in the air while the beast chose which to kill first. If an animal lost interest too quickly, handlers with hot irons or whips would drive it back to the victim, ensuring the crowd got their full measure of cruelty. There was no escape, not from the claws, not from the teeth, not from the eyes of tens of thousands who came to see her suffer. Death could come in minutes or drag on for what felt like hours. The body reduced to torn flesh and shattered bones, while the sand turned dark beneath her. And when at last she stopped moving, the animals might continue to feed, dragging pieces of her away until the handlers drove them back, leaving only mangled remains to be scraped from the arena floor. Her name would not be remembered in honor, only in the satisfaction of a day's entertainment, her death just one more story to brag about over wine. The cruelty of damnatio ad bestias was not simply in the killing, it was in the way Rome turned it into a celebration, making sure that a woman's final moments were spent as a living toy for beasts, her agony feeding the laughter and bloodlust of an empire that saw no line between justice and savagery. Chapter 3, Pornaculae, the sack of horror. There was perhaps no Roman punishment more grotesque in its design than the Pornaculae, and when it fell upon a woman, it became a spectacle of cruelty that even Rome's enemies found difficult to believe. A death that blended humiliation, fear, and slow agonizing suffocation into one final act of state vengeance. This punishment was reserved for the crime of parricide, the killing of a parent, and though rare for women, when it was used, the Romans ensured it would be remembered. From the moment the sentence was passed, the condemned knew she would not die in the open air or under the clean stroke of a sword, but sealed away in darkness, surrounded by living nightmares. First came the preparation, a heavy leather sack, thick and stiff, capable of holding not only the condemned, but 4 other living creatures, a snake, a dog, a rooster, and a monkey, each chosen not just for the chaos they could cause, but for the symbolic torment they brought. She would be stripped of her clothes, her hair sometimes cut away to mark her shame, her hands and feet bound tight so she could not defend herself. The animals were brought in separately, agitated, starving, and enraged. Dogs beaten until they snapped at the air, snakes shaken in baskets until their coils writhed violently, roosters forced into frenzy with blows, and monkeys howling in confusion and anger. Then, with deliberate cruelty, she would be forced into the sack, pressed into the cramped space as the animals were shoved in one by one, the leather closing over their heads, trapping all of them together in a writhing, stinking knot of panic and pain. There was no room to move, barely enough air to breathe. The snake's cold body might coil around her leg or neck, striking at the warmth of her flesh, the dog's teeth tearing at whatever it could reach, the rooster's claws raking at her face, the monkey biting and scratching in blind terror. The sounds inside the sack were muffled but chilling, screams, growls, the hiss of the serpent, the frantic beating of wings, all mixing into a nightmare symphony. Once sealed, the sack was lifted by ropes or carried on poles to the place of execution, often a riverbank or harbor. There was no pause for mercy. The heavy bundle was hurled into the water, where it would sink under its own weight, the last pockets of air filling with the desperate thrashing of its contents. Drowning was inevitable, but it came with the additional torment of bites, scratches, and the crushing pressure of the animals struggling in the same small space. The leather blocked the light entirely. Her last moments were lived in total blackness, unable to see where the next strike would come from, unable to know whether the burning in her lungs was from lack of air or from the sheer terror overwhelming her. If the water was shallow, the sack might roll or bob, prolonging the death, and sometimes it was weighted improperly, so it floated just enough for the animals to survive longer, scratching and clawing until exhaustion overtook them all. Onlookers could only hear the muffled chaos inside, but the Romans savored even that, turning the sounds of panic into proof of justice served. The body was rarely recovered in any dignified way. When the sack was eventually pulled ashore, it would be cut open to reveal the twisted, torn remains. The animals, either dead or barely alive, their fur and feathers matted with blood. For a woman, the cruelty of Poena Colae was sharpened by the fact that it attacked not only her body but her reputation. In Roman eyes, a woman who killed her own parent had committed the ultimate betrayal of the family and the gods, and so she was made to die in a way that symbolized being cast out of the human world entirely, sealed away with beasts, denied even the earth or the pyre for burial. It was a punishment that erased identity, leaving nothing but horror in its wake, and for those forced to watch, it was a reminder that in Rome, justice could take forms that felt less like law and more like ritualized madness. Chapter 4. Burning alive. Death in the flames. There was no quick end in the Roman punishment of burning alive, and when it was inflicted upon a woman, it was done with a precision of cruelty that made the death as slow, public, and humiliating as possible, turning her body into both the fuel and the message. Fire in Rome was feared for its power to destroy entire districts, and so when a woman was condemned to die in it, whether for arson, treason, sacrilege, or crimes that insulted the gods, the sentence became a ritual of both vengeance and spectacle. The execution began long before the flames were lit. She would be stripped of her dignity first, paraded through the streets bound in chains or ropes, her clothes torn away or replaced with rags soaked in pitch, resin, or oil, the stench clinging to her like a grim omen. The place of execution was chosen for its visibility, often a public square, a market, or near a temple, so that as many eyes as possible could witness her destruction. The pyre itself was built high, sometimes as tall as a man, layered with dry wood, kindling, and flammable substances that would ensure a long, hot burn. In some cases, the condemned woman was tied to a stake at the center, her arms bound tightly to her sides so that she could not shield herself, the ropes digging into her skin until they cut and bruised. The Romans enjoyed drawing out the moment, letting her stand there in the rising heat, the smoke beginning to curl upward even before the fire touched her. The first lick of flame was not meant to kill, but to terrify. It began low at the edges of the pyre, sending crackles and sparks into the air while the heat built slowly, baking her flesh before it charred it. The air around her would become almost too thick to breathe, each gasp bringing scorching smoke into her lungs, the heat blistering her skin, her hair curling and burning away in the first waves of fire. If she screamed, the crowd would cheer. If she tried to plead, her voice would be drowned by the roar of the blaze and the shouts of those who had come to see her perish. Some executions used oil-drenched reeds to make the fire leap suddenly upward, engulfing the victim in seconds. Others used damp wood so the smoke would smother before the flames consumed, making her choke and struggle before the real burning began. The worst was when the fire was deliberately kept low, allowing the flames to creep upwards slowly from her feet, the skin blackening and splitting as the heat devoured the muscle beneath, nerves aflame with agony. Every inch of progress another wave of unbearable pain. The smell of burning flesh was thick and unmistakable, drifting over the crowd and embedding itself in the memory of all who breathed it. Sometimes the executioners would prod the pyre with poles to make the fire flare or collapse parts of the wood so the victim fell deeper into the coals, each movement sending a shock of new pain through her body. For women accused of religious crimes, the burning was framed as an offering to the gods, her life force consumed in the same way a sacrifice would be, though everyone knew it was not piety, but power that drove the sentence. There were no final mercies, no swords to cut the agony short, no water to quench the fire. She was left to burn until her body was nothing but blackened remains, her bones cracking in the heat, her skull sometimes bursting from the pressure of steam trapped inside. When the flames finally died, the ash and charred fragments might be scattered to the wind or dumped unceremoniously into a river, denying her the right of burial, ensuring she could not be honored in death. Burning alive was more than execution. It was the transformation of a woman into a living torch, a human warning set ablaze so that all Rome could remember the sight, the sound, the smell, and know what awaited those who defied the empire's will. Chapter 5. Banishment to a desolate island. Death by isolation. There was a special kind of cruelty in the Roman sentence of banishment to a desolate island, and for women it was a punishment that killed not in a moment of spectacle, but in the slow erosion of body and mind, turning each passing day into another step toward a lonely, unmarked grave. Exile in Rome was not the romantic notion of living far away in peace. It was deliberate abandonment, a calculated stripping away of every connection to family, society, and survival itself. When the sentence was given, the condemned woman was removed from her home in chains, her possessions seized, her status erased, and her name spoken only in whispers of disgrace. She was taken under guard to a ship waiting at the docks, the planks already slick with salt water, the smell of tar and seawater mixing with the stench of her fear. These islands were not lush retreats, but barren rocks in the middle of the sea, windswept, treeless, stripped of shelter, and often devoid of fresh water. The voyage itself was the first taste of her isolation, the coastline fading away, the familiar roar of Rome's streets replaced by the endless crash of waves, each passing mile cutting her further from any hope of return. Upon arrival, she would be unloaded like unwanted cargo, sometimes with nothing more than the clothes on her back and a small ration of food to last until the guards sailed away. The Romans knew these places were natural prisons, surrounded by churning waters too cold and violent to swim, patrolled by dangerous currents that could drag even the strongest into the depths. There were no other inhabitants, save perhaps for the occasional bird wheeling overhead or the scuttling of crabs across the rocks. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind screaming over the cliffs at night. Without shelter, she was exposed to the burning sun during the day and the biting cold at night, her skin cracking from salt and wind, her body weakening with each passing week. Food was scarce, sometimes a small patch of edible plants or a few shellfish pried from the rocks. But famine was the real executioner here, and thirst often struck first, the tongue swelling and cracking as days passed without rain. Some islands had caves where she might crouch for warmth, but darkness and damp only brought sickness, her body slowly consumed by fever, malnutrition, and infection. The psychological torment was as sharp as the physical. No human voices, no touch, no comfort, only the endless sound of waves and the knowledge that no one would come for her. Her mind could fray under the weight of that silence, imagining voices in the wind, seeing faces in the rocks, speaking aloud just to remember the sound of her own voice. For noble women, the fall was even more brutal. Once surrounded by attendants and luxury, they were reduced to scratching at the earth with their hands, drinking from puddles and wrapping themselves in whatever rags they could scavenge to survive another night. Death came slowly, but when it did, it was unceremonious. Sometimes she simply lay down and could not rise again, her body stiffening in the cold, the tide creeping in to take her. Weeks or months later, the bones might be scattered by the wind, the skull rolling down a cliff into the sea, erasing her existence completely. There were no pyres, no funeral rites, no inscriptions carved to remember her name. In Rome's eyes, she had already ceased to exist the moment the ship left her on that shore. Banishment to a desolate island was not just a sentence of removal, it was a calculated erasure, a living death where the empire's hand reached across the sea to ensure that the condemned woman's final days were spent not in fire or blood, but in a slow, relentless starvation of the body and soul, until she became part of the barren rock itself, unmarked, unmourned, and utterly forgotten. Chapter 6: Public Scourging and Humiliation. Flesh torn for the crowd. The public scourging of a woman in ancient Rome was not simply a beating. It was a staged dissection of her dignity, her body, and her humanity, carried out under the gaze of a crowd that gathered to savor her pain. This punishment was both a spectacle and a warning, meant to etch the price of defiance into the memories of all who watched. From the moment the sentence was passed, the condemned woman was no longer a person in the eyes of Rome, but a living canvas upon which the state would paint its message in blood. She would be dragged from her cell, her clothes ripped from her body until she stood half-naked or fully exposed, because shame was as much a weapon as the whip. Her arms were bound tightly, sometimes above her head, sometimes stretched wide and fixed to a post, ensuring she could neither shield her face nor protect her skin. The whip itself was not a simple leather strap. It was the flagrum, a multi-thonged instrument often embedded with bone or metal hooks that tore away flesh with each strike. The first lash was always a shock, a white-hot line of agony searing across her back or shoulders. But it was the repetition, the unrelenting rhythm of the blows, that stripped away her strength. The skin would open quickly under the hooks, blood rising in beads before spilling down her sides, soaking into the ground, the metallic scent heavy in the air. Sometimes the punishment was methodical, the executioner aiming for different parts of her body, shoulders, back, thighs, turning her slowly so the crowd could see every wound, every wince, every strangled cry. The crowd was not silent. They jeered, laughed, and shouted insults, some urging the executioner to strike harder, others mocking the woman's screams. The humiliation was deliberate. In Rome, the loss of modesty was itself a form of death for a woman, and the officials ensured the memory of her exposed and broken form would follow her even if she survived. Her hair might be pulled and cut away mid-punishment, not as an act of mercy, but as an added insult, stripping her of one of the key markers of Roman femininity. The sun would burn her raw skin, the dust would cling to the blood, flies gathering at the open wounds before the punishment had even ended. And it did not always end quickly. Some scourging sessions lasted hours, with breaks only, so the executioner could rest his arm or dip the whip in water to make it heavier and more punishing upon impact. For women condemned for crimes like theft, adultery, or defiance of authority, scourging was often followed by further penalties, enslavement, exile, or execution. But sometimes it was the sole sentence, a cruel mercy that left the victim alive but permanently scarred, physically and socially. Surviving such an ordeal meant living with deep, jagged wounds that often became infected, turning the days after into another layer of torment, fever burning through a body already weakened by blood loss. Those who did not survive the whip died in public, their bodies slumping against the post, skin in ribbons, their last breath taken to the sound of a cheering crowd. Even in death, the humiliation was not over. The corpse might be left on display for hours, a final warning to others, the marks of the whip standing as mute testimony to Rome's absolute power over life, flesh, and the very sense of self. For a Roman woman, public scourging was more than pain. It was the empire's way of peeling away every layer of her existence until there was nothing left but blood, shame, and silence. Chapter 7: Execution by Beheading, the Blade's Final Judgment. Beheading in ancient Rome was often called a merciful punishment, but for women condemned to this fate, there was nothing merciful about the reality. The act was swift only in the final second. Everything before that moment was engineered to strip away any remaining sense of control, dignity, or hope. A woman marked for beheading would first be paraded before the public or brought to the place of execution under heavy guard, her wrists bound and her clothing, sometimes deliberately torn, to make her appear disheveled and broken. The crowd would gather not in reverent silence, but in cruel anticipation, because executions were entertainment as much as they were justice. She would be forced to kneel, often on cold stone or damp earth, positioned so her neck was fully exposed to the executioner's sword or axe. The weapon itself was not a symbol of honor here. It was an instrument of humiliation, wielded by a man who had no concern for grace or dignity. Some executions were botched intentionally, the first blow striking but failing to sever the head completely, turning what could have been instantaneous death into a prolonged agony of repeated strikes, each one more clumsy and brutal than the last. The condemned woman's hair, a mark of beauty in Roman society, might be yanked back or hacked away to expose the nape of her neck, a final insult before the steel met flesh. If the executioner was unskilled or simply cruel, he might miss the vital spot, causing the victim to cry out in pain, her body convulsing as blood sprayed across the stones and onto the onlookers in the front rows. Those closest to her could hear the wet, tearing sound of muscle and sinew giving way under the blade, the sickening thud when the severed head finally fell, the metallic tang of blood instantly filling the air. Some heads were displayed immediately after, held aloft for the crowd to see, the lifeless face still twisted in the final expression of terror or pain. In certain cases, the head was placed on a spike or brought to the authorities as proof that justice had been carried out, a grotesque trophy to be gawked at. For women accused of treason, betrayal, or political plotting, the spectacle of beheading was amplified. Guards might force her to endure verbal taunts from the audience, mocking her fall from whatever social standing she once held. The body, headless and slumped in the dirt, was often left for a time before being removed, both to heighten the horror for witnesses and to serve as a stark reminder of Rome's ability to strip life away in an instant. Even though beheading was considered less degrading than crucifixion or the arena, for a woman it was still an obliteration of her identity, reducing her entire existence to a public moment of slaughter. In those last moments before the blade struck, she might try to speak, to protest her innocence or curse her enemies, but her words would be drowned out by the noise of the crowd, the clamor for the executioner to get on with it. And when it was done, the silence that followed was not respect. It was the satisfied quiet of an audience whose appetite for blood had been briefly fed. Beheading in Rome was not just the taking of a life. It was the final act in a carefully orchestrated display of dominance, a cold demonstration that no woman, no matter her beauty, status, or innocence, was beyond the reach of the empire's blade. Chapter 8. Strangulation in the Tullianum. Death in the pit of filth. Strangulation in the Tullianum was not simply an execution. It was a descent into Rome's most infamous chamber of death, a place where the punishment began the moment the condemned woman crossed the threshold. The Tullianum, Rome's underground prison, was a dark, airless pit beneath the Mamertine complex, its walls slick with centuries of filth, slime, and human decay. There was no light except what the guards brought with them, and even that flickering torchlight seemed swallowed by the damp, suffocating blackness. The floor was uneven, often covered with stagnant water that stank of rot, and the air was so foul that breathing felt like swallowing disease. A woman sentenced to die here was led down a narrow, twisting staircase, or lowered by rope through a small opening, the stone scraping her skin as she descended into the void. Once inside, the stench was overwhelming, an acrid mix of mold, urine, sweat, and the lingering odor of decomposed bodies that had once been left to rot. The execution method was simple but horrifying: strangulation by rope. The guards, often hardened men with no trace of pity, would force her to her knees in the slippery darkness, their hands gripping her shoulders to keep her still. The rope itself was coarse, often already stained with the sweat and blood of previous victims. It was looped around her neck from behind, so she could not see her killer's face. There were no speeches, no final words, no audience beyond the executioners. The punishment was designed to be silent and absolute. Death in darkness, unseen by the public but still dripping with cruelty. As the rope tightened, the fibers bit into the skin, grinding into flesh with merciless pressure. The condemned woman would thrash at first, instinctively clawing at the cord cutting off her air, but the guards held her fast, tightening with slow, deliberate force. The sound of her choking breaths and strained gurgles would echo off the stone walls, mingling with the faint drip of water somewhere in the blackness. Her eyes would bulge, her face turning deep shades of red and purple as the blood vessels burst beneath the skin. Sometimes the executioner would make it worse, tightening, then loosening slightly to prolong the moment, forcing her to hover on the edge of consciousness again and again until she finally had no strength left to fight. In the pitch dark, she could feel the rough stone at her knees, the icy water soaking into her clothes, and the coarse rope sawing into her throat. The pain was not clean or sharp. It was suffocating, crushing, an unbearable pressure from which there was no escape. The final moments were often marked by spasms, her body jerking uncontrollably as her lungs screamed for air, and her vision narrowed into blackness. When it was over, her body would slump forward, still bound, her head hanging lifelessly against her chest. In some cases, the corpse was left there for hours or even days before being removed, the Tullianum claiming her as part of its foul atmosphere. For women accused of treason or sacrilege, this was considered fitting. There would be no honorable death, no clean burial, just an anonymous end in the bowels of Rome, swallowed by darkness and filth. The Tullianum's strangulation was not about efficiency, it was about erasure. It stripped away the condemned woman's final moments of dignity, replacing them with the image of her body crumpled in the wet, stinking void, unseen but no less brutal than the most public of executions. Here, the empire did not need a crowd to demonstrate its power. The cold, silent walls of the Tullianum bore witness enough. Chapter 9, Exposure of the Body, Death by Public Violation. Exposure of the body as a punishment for women in ancient Rome was a slow, degrading destruction that began not with pain, but with the deliberate stripping away of dignity, forcing the condemned into a state where she was no longer seen as human, but as an object to be destroyed. It was a form of execution that mingled humiliation with physical torment, ensuring the suffering struck at both flesh and spirit. The process began with the public stripping, often done in the center of a crowded forum or amphitheater, where the air was thick with the voices of spectators who had gathered not merely to watch a death, but to savor the spectacle of shame. Soldiers or guards would rip away her garments, tearing the fabric with loud, deliberate jerks, so that each shred falling to the ground marked the collapse of her identity as a Roman woman. This was not only about nudity, it was about erasing her social standing, her modesty, her very name. In a society where a woman's virtue was tied to her body, this exposure was a symbolic execution even before the physical one began. Once stripped, she would be bound in a way that made her exposure unavoidable. Arms pulled back until the shoulders strained, legs forced apart, or shackled to posts so that movement was limited, leaving her completely vulnerable to the elements in the eyes of the crowd. The Romans understood the cruelty of helplessness, and here it was weaponized. The punishment might be carried out in the blistering heat of midday, the sun baking her bare skin until it burned, sweat stinging in her eyes, or during the chill of early morning when the cold gnawed at her bones. Her position was often deliberately uncomfortable, standing on tiptoe with wrists tied high, or kneeling with her back arched painfully so that every muscle ached within minutes. The brutality did not end with physical exposure. It was intensified by verbal abuse from the crowd, a chorus of mockery, slurs, and lewd taunts that poured over her like boiling oil. Sometimes fruit, stones, or refuse would be hurled at her body, each strike leaving a new bruise or cut. The guards, too, could join in the cruelty, pushing her, striking her, or laughing as she tried in vain to shield herself. In the most vicious cases, this stage became a sanctioned opportunity for sexual violence, carried out in plain sight of the audience, an act meant to destroy not just the body, but the very core of the victim's humanity. Death itself could come in several forms after the exposure had done its work. Sometimes she would be left tied to a post for hours or even days, denied food and water until thirst, hunger, and exhaustion weakened her to the point where she could barely lift her head. In other cases, exposure was the prelude to a more violent execution. Flogging until the flesh hung in strips, stoning until bones shattered, or dragging her lifeless body through the streets as a final public display. The Roman idea of justice in this punishment was not swift or merciful. It was a drawn-out performance, a ritual of breaking someone down before killing them, ensuring they were already destroyed before the final blow. The worst part of exposure was that it turned the crowd into accomplices. The punishment relied on the gaze of others, on their willingness to see and not look away, on their hunger for the degradation of another human being. For the condemned woman, this meant there was no corner to hide in, no shadow to retreat to, Every moment was lit by the merciless daylight or the torch's glare, every breath a reminder that she was being consumed by the eyes and voices around her. In the end, when her body was finally still, there would be no ceremonial burial, no rites to honor the dead. Her corpse might be left for scavenging dogs or thrown into the Tiber, discarded like waste, as though she had never been part of the city at all. This was the true purpose of exposure in ancient Rome. Not just to kill, but to erase, to turn a living woman into nothing more than a spectacle, and then into nothing at all. Chapter 10, Burial Alive, the fate of the condemned Vestal. Burial alive was one of the most haunting punishments in ancient Rome, reserved for the most sacred and therefore the most devastating of betrayals, when a Vestal virgin broke her vow of chastity. The cruelty of this execution lay in its calculated slowness, in the fact that it did not rely on the swift brutality of the sword or the spectacle of the arena, but instead used silence, darkness, and suffocating isolation as the instruments of death. A Vestal virgin was not an ordinary woman. She was a living embodiment of Rome's purity, chosen as a child to serve the goddess Vesta for 30 years. Her vow was absolute, and to violate it was considered not just a personal sin, but an act that could bring divine wrath upon the entire city. For such a crime, Roman law did not permit her blood to be shed, so they found a way to kill her without spilling a drop. The execution began with a procession through the city. The condemned Vestal, dressed in her sacred white robes, was paraded in a slow march toward the place of burial. The air would be heavy with the weight of ritual. Citizens lined the streets, not shouting or jeering as in other punishments, but watching in an eerie silence as though they were witnessing a funeral. Guards flanked her on all sides, but their hands did not bind her. There was no need, for she walked willingly, as custom demanded, knowing the end was inevitable. Every step toward the field beyond the city walls was another step away from the light of the sun, another step into the grave. At the site, a small underground chamber had been prepared, no larger than a cramped cell, dug deep into the earth and lined with stone. Inside, a bed, a lamp, and a small amount of food and water awaited her, not as mercy, but as a cruel pretense that this was not outright murder. The Romans told themselves they were not killing her, only placing her in a position where the gods could decide her fate. But in truth, the meager provisions were there to prolong the suffering, to stretch her life out for a few more hours or days so that she could feel every creeping moment of her own slow demise. When the time came, she descended a ladder into the chamber. The ladder was then drawn up, and the entrance sealed with heavy earth and stones, cutting off the light. Above her, priests and officials performed solemn rites, chanting prayers to Vesta as if to purify the act, though in reality it was an act of state-sanctioned cruelty. As the last shovelfuls of dirt thudded down, the sound grew muffled until there was nothing but the suffocating quiet of the grave. In that dark, airless chamber, death came not as a sudden blow, but as a lingering shadow. The Vestal would feel the air grow stale, her breath growing shallow as oxygen thinned. The lamp might flicker and die, leaving her in absolute darkness. Hunger would gnaw at her, thirst would scorch her throat, and the weight of the earth above would press down like an invisible hand. Every heartbeat became a reminder that she was trapped beneath the world, buried but still breathing, with nothing but silence and the knowledge of her own isolation for company. The mind itself could become an enemy, conjuring visions, whispers, and the sensation of movement in the pitch-black void. The Romans did not allow her body to be recovered. Once the burial chamber was sealed, it became her tomb forever, inaccessible to family, friends, or mourners. She was left to decay beneath the soil, her remains mingling with the earth in a place that would never be marked. In the eyes of the people, she ceased to exist entirely. In the eyes of the state, she had been erased without the stain of spilled blood. What made this punishment so terrifying was not just its physical reality, but its psychological horror. To die alone in the dark, hearing one's own heartbeat echo in a chamber of stone, was to experience death as an unbroken chain of moments, each one more suffocating than the last. There was no fight, no violent struggle, no quick escape from pain. The cruelty lay in making the victim endure the slow realization that she would never again feel sunlight on her face, never again hear the sound of another human voice, never again touch the world of the living. This execution was rare, but its rarity made it all the more powerful. When a Vestal was condemned, the entire city took notice. The spectacle was not one of gore, but of ritual purity turned to ritual death, and the memory of it lingered in the minds of all who witnessed it. Even hardened Roman citizens, accustomed to the sight of blood in the arena, spoke of burial alive with a kind of hushed dread. It was a punishment designed to break not just the body, but the very idea of the person, sealing them away until even memory could not reach them. In the deep silence beneath the earth, the vestal's final moments would stretch into an eternity, until breath and thought faded together into nothing. Chapter 11. Exposure and Starvation, Death in the Open. Exposure and starvation was among the most merciless punishments inflicted on women in ancient Rome, a method that did not require sword or flame, but instead used the slow and pitiless forces of nature to carry out the sentence. The condemned was abandoned, sometimes in the wilderness, sometimes in a remote corner of the city, stripped of all protection, left to the mercy of the sun, wind, and cold. Her death was not sudden. It was a gradual unraveling of the body, a process drawn out until the last reserves of strength were drained, and all hope of survival was extinguished. The cruelty of this punishment was amplified by the fact that it turned the environment itself into an executioner, transforming every moment into a fresh assault against life. The punishment began with deliberate humiliation. The condemned woman would often be stripped of her fine garments and left in little more than rags, ensuring that her suffering began with the loss of dignity. In some cases, her hands and feet might be bound to slow her movement, though often there was no need. Her placement in an isolated spot made escape impossible. If she was left within the city, it would be in a location carefully chosen for public visibility, such as near the marketplace or along a busy road, where passers-by could witness her slow decline. If she was abandoned outside the city, it might be in a desolate patch of land with no shelter, no food, and no water source within reach. From the first moment, the body began its slow descent into agony. Hunger clawed at the stomach, first as a dull ache, then as a sharp, twisting pain that never fully subsided. Without food, the body began consuming its own reserves, muscles growing weaker, skin growing pale, and the mind becoming clouded with confusion. Thirst came even faster than hunger, cracking the lips and turning the tongue into a swollen, useless weight in the mouth. The sun would burn the skin during the day, blisters rising from prolonged exposure, while the night air brought shivering cold that made sleep impossible. Each breath became a reminder that survival was slipping further away. The psychological torment was as severe as the physical. Abandoned and alone, the woman could do nothing but wait for death. If she was placed in public, she would be forced to endure the stares, whispers, and occasional taunts of onlookers. The Romans were not strangers to cruelty. Some might stop to jeer or mock, others might ignore her entirely, treating her as if she were already a corpse. On rare occasions, a sympathetic passerby might attempt to offer water or food, but this was often forbidden under penalty of law. The woman's suffering was meant to be uninterrupted, unsoftened by mercy. If she was left in the wilderness, the isolation was its own punishment, replacing the jeers of the crowd with the endless silence of the empty land. As days passed, the body began to wither visibly. The stomach collapsed inward, the skin clung tightly to bone, and sores appeared where the body had lain too long in one position. The eyes became sunken, their brightness replaced with a glassy, faraway look. Weakness grew so great that movement became impossible. Even sitting upright required more strength than she had left. At this stage, the mind often began to falter. Hallucinations could come, visions of food, water, or shelter that weren't truly there. The line between reality and dream blurred, until consciousness was little more than a drifting haze punctuated by waves of pain. In some cases, exposure was used as a public warning, especially for crimes considered deeply shameful or threatening to the social order. The slow and visible nature of the punishment meant that it could serve as a grim reminder to all who passed by. This is the fate of those who defy the laws of Rome. Mothers might avert their children's eyes, merchants might shake their heads in feigned disapproval, but all of them understood the intended message. Rome's authority was absolute, and defiance could strip a person not just of life, but of humanity itself. The final stages of this punishment were marked by a kind of stillness. The victim's body, no longer capable of resisting, surrendered to the inevitable. Breathing grew shallow and erratic. The heart struggled to keep its pace. In the wilderness, the sounds of the natural world, wind in the grass, distant animal cries, would be the last sensations. In the city, it might be the sound of footsteps, the murmur of the crowd, or the indifference of life continuing around her. When death finally came, it was not sudden but crept in like a shadow, ending not just the body's suffering, but the slow disintegration of the mind. Once the woman was dead, her body was often left in place for some time, serving as an additional warning. In the wilderness, scavenging animals might come, completing the work that hunger and thirst had begun. In public areas, the corpse might be removed by slaves or left to rot until the smell forced its disposal. There was no funeral, no rites, no dignity in death, only the quiet erasure of a life that had been deemed unworthy of saving. Exposure and starvation was not the most dramatic of Roman punishments, but it was one of the most inescapably cruel. It relied not on spectacle, but on the slow, deliberate dismantling of a person's body and spirit. The victim was given no weapon, no chance for defense, no swift release. Death came only after the full measure of human suffering had been extracted, after every hour had been stretched into a fresh trial of endurance. It was a punishment that left behind no heroic last stand, no defiant words to echo in memory, only the image of a body wasting away in plain sight until it became nothing more than part of the landscape. In this way, Rome demonstrated not just its power over life, but its ability to strip life of all meaning before finally extinguishing it. Chapter 12. Torture before trial. Confessions carved in pain. Torture before trial was one of the most feared realities for women in ancient Rome, for it was a punishment that began before guilt was even proven and often ended in death long before a verdict was reached. It was not designed merely to gather facts. It was meant to break the body and mind, to force a confession, whether true or false, to demonstrate that the state had the power to wring the truth from flesh by any means necessary. In the eyes of Roman law, the confession was not the product of free will, but the product of endurance, and the victim's endurance was not meant to last. For women accused of crimes, especially those from the lower classes or enslaved, torture was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. From the moment she was accused, the condemned woman could be seized and taken to the place of torment, often a dim, enclosed space where the air was heavy with the smell of sweat, blood, and burned metal. There, her fate was placed in the hands of executioners, whose purpose was not to kill swiftly, but to cause suffering so precise and prolonged that the mind would shatter and the body would betray its secrets. The accused would be bound in ways that restricted movement entirely, wrists tied tightly enough to cut into skin, ankles locked in iron clamps, sometimes suspended from ropes that pulled the arms painfully above the head. These restraints were not only practical, they were part of the punishment, ensuring that pain began before the real torture even started. The methods themselves varied, each more brutal than the last. The strappado was common. The woman would be hoisted by her arms, tied behind her back, and then dropped suddenly, wrenching her shoulders from their sockets with a sickening crack. She might be whipped as she hung, the lashes biting into her back, tearing skin and leaving it raw. Hot irons could be applied to sensitive parts of the body, burning flesh until the stench filled the room. Sometimes wooden wedges were hammered between the fingers or toes, crushing bones slowly so that each moment was an agony in itself. For the Romans, the idea was simple. Pain could force truth from even the most stubborn lips. But for the victims, truth was irrelevant. They would say whatever their tormentors wished to hear if it meant the agony would stop. This was why the system was so vicious. Confessions obtained under such conditions could be entirely fabricated, yet they were treated as fact. A woman could be innocent of the crime, yet still die because the pain was too great to survive. Many did not even make it to trial. Their bodies collapsed under the repeated assaults, leaving only a lifeless form to be presented as the final witness against itself. The brutality was not limited to the physical. Torture before trial also sought to strip away the victim's dignity. Clothing might be torn away, leaving her exposed before her interrogators, adding humiliation to pain. Verbal abuse accompanied the physical attacks, designed to weaken her spirit and make her feel powerless. Days and nights could blend together in an unbroken chain of torment, with brief periods of rest only to ensure that she remained alive for the next session. The mind, overwhelmed by pain and fear, often broke entirely, reducing the accused to little more than a trembling shadow of herself. The tools of this punishment were as cruel as the hands that wielded them. Whips made of leather thongs tipped with metal hooks could tear flesh with every strike. Branding irons, heated until they glowed, were pressed against skin, leaving permanent scars or opening deep wounds. Chains and manacles were designed not just to restrain, but to dig into flesh, creating sores that festered over time. The rack could stretch a body to the point of tearing muscles and dislocating joints, each turn of the wheel drawing out screams that echoed through the stone chambers. One of the most insidious aspects of torture before trial was that it did not require a sentence to begin, only suspicion. An accusation from a powerful citizen could be enough to set the process in motion, especially if the accused was a woman without status or protection. Wealth and connections could sometimes shield the elite, but even noble women could be subjected to it if the crime was considered grave enough or politically dangerous. For enslaved women, the rules were even harsher. Their testimony was not considered valid unless extracted under torture, ensuring that pain was not just likely but legally required. The fatality rate from such torture was high. Bones crushed, wounds infected, internal injuries left untreated, all could end a life within days. Even those who survived were often permanently crippled or disfigured. The long-term effects were rarely considered. The focus was on the immediate breaking of will. Death during interrogation was not seen as a failure, but as an acceptable outcome, especially if the victim had confessed before the end. This ensured that the process was not merely investigative, it was punitive in itself, functioning as a form of execution that left the semblance of legality intact. For the Romans, torture before trial served several purposes. It was a tool of intimidation, a warning to others that accusations carried not just the risk of punishment, but the certainty of suffering. It reinforced the authority of the state, demonstrating that its reach extended not only to those found guilty, but to those who had yet to be judged. It created an atmosphere of fear in which obedience was the safest choice and silence was a survival strategy. In this way, the punishment reached beyond the victim to touch all who witnessed or heard of it. The cruelty of this practice lay in its complete disregard for truth or justice. It operated on the belief that pain could purify the truth from the lies, but in reality, it simply overwhelmed the mind until it would say anything to make the pain stop. This meant that guilt and innocence were irrelevant. Survival, not justice, was the determining factor in whether someone reached the end of their trial alive. And for many women in ancient Rome, survival under such conditions was a hope too fragile to endure. When the process ended, whether by confession, collapse, or death, the victim was either sent to trial already broken or laid out lifeless, her body bearing the unmistakable marks of her suffering. There was no public outcry, for the people accepted this as a normal part of Roman justice. Pain had been inflicted, the state's authority maintained, and the example made. The accused woman, once a living being with thoughts, memories, and loved ones, was reduced to a tool of deterrence. Her screams now silent, her story swallowed by the unyielding machinery of Roman law. Torture before trial was not just a prelude to punishment, it was a punishment in itself, one that blurred the line between justice and cruelty until there was no line left to see. For those who endured it, there was no question that the process was designed not to find truth, but to destroy the person until only a confession or a corpse remained. In this way, Rome maintained its control, not through fairness or reason, but through the knowledge that at any moment, pain could become the language of the law. Congratulations, you made it through this video without being burned, beaten, or buried alive. Reward yourself. Subscribe now, before the Senate changes its mind.